The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous, silent courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of old wood polish, stale paper, and the faint metallic tang of collective anxiety. "Order in the court," the bailiff boomed, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings, but it was just a distant rumble to me, a meaningless sound in a world that had shrunk to the frantic, suffocating drumming in my own ears. All I could hear was the wild thumping of my heart against my ribs, a desperate prisoner trying to break free. I just stood there, frozen beside my lawyer's table, my hands so clammy I was afraid they'd leave damp prints on the mahogany surface. I felt a wave of dizziness, and the faces in the jury box blurred into a vague, judgmental smear. I was barely able to draw a full breath. Across the room, framed beneath the imposing gold-leafed state seal, sat the two people I was once forced, by law and circumstance, to call Mom and Dad, Richard and Carol Miller. And as they looked at me, their faces held no trace of regret, no flicker of anger, not even a shadow of shame. They were smirking. It was a specific kind of smirk, a masterpiece of quiet condescension they had perfected over a lifetime. It wasn't a wide, obvious grin. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of their mouths, a slight lift of the chin, an expression that said, "Look at you. How pathetic." It was the exact same smirk I had seen 1,000 times before, a constant punctuation mark in the story of my childhood. I saw it at the dinner table when I was 7, my hand trembling as I reached for the salad fork instead of the dinner fork, and Carol had sighed with theatrical exasperation. I saw it at school plays, the one time I had a small role, when I fumbled a single line and Richard's face in the audience was a mask of cold disappointment. It was the smirk I saw on my 18th birthday, a day that should have been a celebration, but instead became an execution. It was there right before they handed me a thick envelope containing a one-way bus ticket and $5,000, casually and efficiently throwing me out of their lives as if I were last season's fashion. For 18 years they had honed the art of breaking my spirit, piece by tiny piece. And now they were here in this temple of justice, to take the very last thing I had left, my own story, my own truth. But they had no idea what was coming. They sat there, cocooned in their wealth and arrogance, utterly oblivious. They couldn't have possibly known that their entire meticulously constructed world of lies, their public facade of sainthood, was about to be ripped apart and exposed in the most brutally public way you could ever imagine. And neither did the judge, the Honorable Maria Sanchez. She sat on her high bench, the picture of judicial authority, a woman known for her iron will and sharp intellect. In just a few moments she would freeze mid-sentence, her face becoming a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief, as a 30-year-old secret, a ghost from the past, came crashing down on all of us with the force of a tidal wave. Before I get into the shocking details of what happened next, and how one person's memory changed everything, I just want to say that if you're finding this story compelling, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference and really helps the channel out. I have so much more of this story to share, and I'd be honored if you would stick around for the rest of it. It all started 30 years ago, not in a grand courtroom, but in a drab, beige-walled office at the city's social services department, a place that smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. I was just a baby, a nameless ward of the state with only a tag on my bassinet bearing the name a kind nurse had given me, Anna. Then Richard and Carol Miller showed up, sweeping into the dreary office like figures from another world, radiating wealth and confidence. On paper they were flawless. A rich, philanthropic couple, pillars of the community, tragically unable to have children of their own, looking to bestow a storybook life upon a disadvantaged child. In our city, they were practically royalty, their surname carved onto the marble donor plaques of museums, hospitals, and university libraries. Adopting me, a mixed-race baby, was their crowning achievement in public charity, the ultimate charitable accessory. The local papers and television news stations ate it up, splashing our picture across their pages with gushing headlines. A testament to their boundless generosity, one article read. "The Millers give hope," read another. They were saints, and I was their tiny living proof. From the outside, my childhood looked exactly like that fairy tale they had sold to the press. I grew up in a sprawling mansion with lawns so green and perfectly manicured they looked like astroturf. I wore expensive, uncomfortable clothes with names I couldn't pronounce and was shuttled to the best, most exclusive private schools. But inside those gilded, silent walls, I was not a daughter. I was a prop. I was a beautiful, breathing, walking, talking testament to their wonderfulness. And my one and only job was to play the part of the grateful, saved orphan with quiet, smiling perfection. My earliest, most vivid memories are not of bedtime stories or scraped knees being kissed better. They are of being trotted out at their endless charity galas. I remember the feel of my tiny, sweaty hand in Richard's large, cool one, the blinding flash of photographers' cameras, and the tight, forced smile on my face as they spoke about saving me. "We believe every child deserves a chance," Richard would tell the reporters. His arm clamped around my shoulders in a gesture that looked like affection but felt like possession. "And we're giving Anna the world. A top-tier education, a place in our lives, a future without limits." That phrase, "a future without limits," became the haunting, hollow soundtrack to my youth. They said it loud and proud for the cameras, for the reporters, for anyone who would listen. But the words were just a whisper that evaporated the second the car door closed and we were on our way home. That future they so grandly proclaimed had very clear, very sharp limits. My interests, my dreams, my budding personality. None of it was allowed if it didn't fit neatly into the perfect picture they had painted for themselves. When I discovered a passion for art, spending hours sketching and painting, it was dismissed as a frivolous, messy hobby that wouldn't look good on a university application. They wanted me to excel in economics or pre-law. When I made friends they deemed unsuitable, meaning kids whose parents weren't in their social stratosphere, I was quietly and systematically isolated, my phone privileges revoked, my social life curated until I had no one left. The message, though never spoken aloud, was crystal clear and delivered daily. I was here to make them look good. I was not there to build a life of my own. The elbowing away, the slow, methodical process of being erased, started small. It was a missed school concert, which they claimed was due to a last-minute business dinner. It was a forgotten birthday, replaced a week later with a lavish, impersonal gift handed to me by their assistant. It was a slow, chilling, deliberate process of being made to feel insignificant. But by the time I was a teenager, a storm of hormones and questions and a desperate need to figure out who I was, they didn't even bother being subtle anymore. I was no longer a cute prop. I was an inconvenience, a sullen teenager who was a stain on their perfect, glossy lives. My questions about my birth parents were met with a wall of cold, punishing silence. My very presence at the enormous dinner table, often just the three of us in a room that could seat 20, felt tolerated, not wanted. They saw my growing independence not as a natural part of growing up, but as willful defiance. My desire to be my own person was twisted into the sin of ingratitude. Their ultimate solution was a prestigious, cold-hearted boarding school on the complete opposite side of the country. They sold it to me and to their friends as an incredible life-changing opportunity, a chance to receive an education that was second to none. But I knew what it was. It was an exile. It was a way to remove the inconvenient teenager from their pristine home. For 4 long and incredibly lonely years, I lived in a small, sterile dorm room. My only contact with them dwindled to curt, 5-minute monthly phone calls where they would ask about my grades and nothing else, and holiday cards that I later found out were signed by their personal assistant. I was completely out of sight and, for them, entirely out of mind. Their parental duties were fulfilled in their eyes by the substantial checks they mailed to the school's bursar's office. I managed to get through those years by clinging with all my might to the one promise they hadn't explicitly broken yet: college. They had always talked about it as if it were a foregone conclusion, the final crowning step in their grand philanthropic project of raising me. For them, it was part of the public narrative. For me, it was the single flickering light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. It was my ticket to real freedom, to a life I could finally call my own. That light was violently extinguished on my 18th birthday. I had come home for the summer, my mind buzzing with plans and anxieties about university applications and campus visits. Instead of conversations about my future, the house was filled with an ominous silence. Richard called me into his study. The room was his sanctuary, paneled in dark, imposing mahogany and smelling of old leather, cigar smoke, and generations of entitlement. Carol stood by the unlit fireplace, her arms crossed tightly, her face a blank, impenetrable wall. Richard didn't even bother to ask me to sit down. He just remained seated behind his massive polished desk and slid a thick white envelope across its surface. Stopped a few inches from my hand. "Our legal obligation to you is over, Anna," he said. His voice utterly flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used to discuss stock prices or fire an underperforming employee. "You're an adult now. It is time you made your own way in the world." I just stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. What about college? You always said." Carol cut me off, her voice like the chime of a tiny, ice-cold bell. "What we said was for public appearances, Anna. Surely you're old enough to understand that now. We provided you with a roof over your head and a first-rate education for 18 years. We did our duty. The arrangement is over." The arrangement. That's all I ever was. Not their daughter, not even a foster child. I was a long-term rental, an asset whose lease had just expired. My fingers, trembling, opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000 and a one-way bus ticket to a city 3 states away, a place where I knew no one. They had already packed my bags. They were waiting in the grand foyer. They hadn't just elbowed me away. They had surgically excised me from their lives with a quiet, efficient, breathtaking cruelty they had mastered over 18 long years. The next few years were a desperate, grinding blur of just trying to survive. I worked 2, sometimes 3, soul-crushing minimum-wage jobs at a time to afford the rent on a tiny, dilapidated apartment in a bad neighborhood. I enrolled in night classes at a local community college, exhausted and overwhelmed, but determined not to let them destroy my dream of an education entirely. The shame was a physical weight. I felt completely and utterly worthless. The world, our city, still saw the Millers as saints, which cast me in the role of the ungrateful, troubled child they had been forced to cast out. How could I ever begin to explain to anyone that their famous love was just a performance? That their perfect family was a total, calculated lie? The anger took a very long time to surface. For years, it was buried under layers of grief, humiliation, and a deep-seated feeling that I was somehow fundamentally flawed. But as I slowly, painstakingly started to piece my life back together, as I built a fragile sense of who I was without them, that anger began to smolder. It was the memory of all those public promises, spoken with such sincerity into news cameras, that finally lit the fuse. The interviews, the gala speeches, the glossy magazine articles where they detailed, in glowing terms, the magnificent future they were guaranteeing for me. This wasn't just a private, broken family promise. This was a public declaration they had used to build their brand. It took me another 2 years of scrimping and saving every penny I could to even consider the possibility of legal action. I walked into the office of David Chen, a young, hungry lawyer whose office was in a run-down building that smelled of stale coffee and ambition. I sat across from him, a nervous wreck, and I told him everything, the whole sordid story from beginning to end. He listened patiently, his pen scratching notes on a yellow legal pad, but I could see the professional skepticism clouding his face. "Anna, family promises, even written ones, are notoriously difficult to enforce in a court of law," he explained gently when I finished. "Without a formal contract or a provision in a will, what they said to you verbally probably isn't legally binding." "But they didn't just say it to me," I insisted, my voice shaking with a desperate intensity. "They told the world. They built their entire public reputation on the promise of my future. They used me to get accolades and tax breaks and social standing, and they lied to everyone." Something in David's expression shifted. The skepticism faded, replaced by a flicker of intense curiosity. He leaned forward in his worn-out office chair. They said these things in newspapers. On television. You have proof. I nodded, feeling a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. For years. It's all documented. He was quiet for a long, tense moment, just tapping the end of his pen on his notepad. There's a legal concept, he said slowly, choosing his words with extreme care, called promissory estoppel. It's a long shot, Anna. A real Hail Mary pass. But it basically argues that if someone makes a clear and unambiguous promise, fully expecting you to rely on it, and you do rely on it to your own detriment, that promise can be enforced by a court to prevent a massive injustice. He looked me straight in the eye, and for the very first time, I saw a genuine flicker of hope. They made these promises to the public to boost their image and their status. You, a child, relied on that promise, foregoing other paths. When they broke it, you were left with absolutely nothing. It is not a normal case by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a case. The question is, are you ready for a fight? Because they are going to come at you with everything they've got. They will try to destroy you. I thought of their smirks, their icy voices, the casual cruelty of the word arrangement. I thought of all the years I spent feeling like a ghost in my own home, a prop to be positioned and polished. I am, I said, and my voice was steadier and stronger than it had been in a decade. I've got nothing left to lose. And if you're still with me on this journey, I'd be so grateful if you would take a moment to hit that like button. It tells YouTube you're connecting with this story, and it helps push it out to more people who might need to hear it. Now let's get back to the courtroom. And so, here we were. Months of grueling legal filings, depositions, and procedural battles had all come down to this moment, in this room. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, desperate for escape. David sat beside me. His presence a single point of calm in the swirling storm of my anxiety. He'd warned me it would be brutal, that they would try to tear me apart on the stand. He was right. The miller's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, was exactly the kind of man you'd expect them to hire. Impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than my car, slick, expensive, and oozing a level of condescension that made my skin crawl. In his opening statement, he masterfully painted me as a troubled, greedy, and manipulative young woman, a disgruntled adoptee, attempting to extort a fortune from the loving, saintly parents who had given me everything. He peppered his speech with words like entitled, opportunistic, and ungrateful. By the time he smoothly returned to his seat, I could feel the jury's eyes on me, their expressions hardening, their minds already closing. Then Richard and Carol took the stand, one after the other. They were incredible, truly gifted actors. With carefully crafted sadness in their voices and glistening eyes, they spoke of their deep, unwavering love for me and their profound disappointment in the person I had become. They took every painful memory, every instance of their neglect, and expertly twisted it into a story of my failure, not theirs. The exile to boarding school wasn't an act of removal. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to provide the structure she so clearly needed. Kicking me out on my 18th birthday wasn't abandonment. It was an act of tough love, a difficult but necessary lesson to teach me independence. We would have happily paid for any college she wanted to attend, Richard said, looking directly at the jury. His voice thick with fake emotion. It was all we ever wanted for her. But she had become defiant. She refused our help at every turn. It broke our hearts, Carol's and mine, but as parents, we had to respect her wishes to make her own way. It was such a monstrous, audacious lie that for a second, the air left my lungs. I felt the blood drain from my face and I looked at David in a blind panic, my eyes screaming. He can't just say that. David, however, remained perfectly calm. He just gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. A silent command. When it was finally my turn to take the stand, my legs felt like they were made of lead. Walking to the witness box felt like walking a green mile. I told them my truth. I spoke about the years of profound loneliness, the constant gnawing feeling of being an outsider in my own home. I talked about the glaring contrast between the public promises and the private dismissals, about feeling like an object in their vast collection of philanthropic good deeds. Thorne's cross-examination was an exercise in pure, calculated cruelty. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet, fake sympathy, "you claim you were unhappy. Yet, by your own admission, you had the best of everything. The best clothes, the best schools, a beautiful home. Most people in this world would call that an extraordinary privilege, not a source of pain. Isn't it true that you're just spectacularly ungrateful? Material things are not a substitute for love or a sense of belonging," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "So you decided you were entitled to their money instead of their love?" He shot back, his voice turning sharp. "I decided I was entitled to the future they promised me, and the entire world they would provide," I answered, my voice finding a strength I didn't know it had. The battle raged on for days. David presented our core evidence. A tall, damning stack of old magazines and newspaper clippings, their glossy pages showing the Millers smiling benevolently with a young, often awkward-looking me. He played a local news clip from a hospital wing dedication ceremony. There was Richard, his arm tightly around a 10-year-old me, speaking into the microphone. "Our daughter Anna is the inspiration for all of this." His voice boomed from the courtroom speakers. "And we have made absolutely sure that her own future is just as bright as the one she inspires us to build for others. A trust is already in place to ensure she has every opportunity imaginable when she comes of age." Thorne and the Millers just scoffed. They didn't even try to deny it. It was just PR they claimed on the stand. "Words spoken to inspire others to give," Carol said with an airy, dismissive wave of her hand, as if swatting away a fly. "It wasn't a contract. It was rhetoric." Their arrogance was simply stunning. They were openly admitting, in a court of law, that their entire public image was a carefully constructed fraud. And as they did, I saw a flicker of doubt, then another, in the eyes of a few of the jurors. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally starting to see the cracks in the perfect facade. The tension in the room was suffocating as the trial neared its end. Throughout it all, Judge Maria Sanchez had been a rock, her face stern, impartial, and unreadable. She was legendary for her sharp legal mind and her absolute, unwavering control of her courtroom. She was reviewing some documents, a thick file from the original adoption, when she suddenly went still. Her eyes, which had been scanning the page, lifted and fixed on Richard Miller. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence. "Just to clarify a point in the adoption record for the court. Do you happen to remember the name of the social worker who finalized Anna's adoption 30 years ago?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. Felt random, trivial. Marcus Thorne started to rise from his chair to object on the grounds of relevance, but the judge just held up a single slender hand, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. He gave a small, dismissive wave of his hand. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that was 3 decades ago. I can't possibly be expected to remember the name of every clerk or functionary we've dealt with over the years. It was some woman. It's completely irrelevant." But Judge Sanchez didn't look away. Her stoic expression began to shift, to crumble. The color drained from her face with startling speed, leaving her skin a pasty, ashen gray. Her sharp, focused eyes went wide and suddenly unfocused, as if she were staring at something far beyond the courtroom walls, at a memory she had long since buried. The pen in her hand began to tremble, then more violently, before it clattered from her grasp onto the wooden surface of the bench. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a choked, strangled little gasp came out. And then, there was nothing. Absolute silence. She just sat there, frozen in time, her face a mask of pure, unfiltered, bottomless shock. The formidable American judge, the unshakable Maria Sanchez, had simply stopped. "It would mean the world to me if you could take a moment to comment below. Let me know what you think is going to happen next. Every comment helps build our community, and I read as many as I can." The courtroom held its collective breath for 1, 2, 3 seconds, and then the spell broke and chaos erupted. "Your Honor! Your Honor!" the bailiff yelled, rushing towards the bench. Lawyers on both sides were on their feet, whispering frantically to each other. Even Richard and Carol looked shaken from their smug complacency, their eyes wide with confusion and alarm. Judge Sanchez was conscious, but she was gone. Her eyes were still locked on Richard Miller, but it was clear she wasn't seeing the man in the expensive suit before her. She was seeing a ghost from 30 years ago. The bailiff gently helped her from her chair, and the court was immediately and abruptly recessed. An hour later, an hour that felt like a lifetime, David emerged from the judge's chambers, his face pale and his expression dazed. "You are not going to believe this," he whispered, pulling me into a small, empty conference room. "The judge. Judge Sanchez. She was your social worker." I just stared at him, the words not making any sense. "What are you talking about? Her name wasn't Sanchez then. It was Hernandez. Maria Hernandez. She was a brand new caseworker, fresh out of college. Your adoption was one of her very first cases. When you were on the stand, she said something about your past felt familiar. But when she asked Richard for her name and he just arrogantly brushed it off as some irrelevant woman, it all came flooding back. She didn't just recognize him. She remembered the entire case. The judge presiding over my case was a key, forgotten figure from its very beginning. She has to recuse herself, obviously," David said, beginning to pace the small room, his mind clearly racing. "A mistrial will be declared in our current case. But that's not all. She told me she always remembered your case because something felt profoundly off about the Millers. She thought they were too polished, too smooth, their answers too rehearsed. And she remembers something else. Something vital she was instructed to document." Judge Hernandez, as she now insisted on being called in this matter, remembered an addendum, a special, legally binding condition that had been attached to my final adoption decree. It was something my birth mother had arranged in the final weeks of her life. My birth mother, she learned, was a young, brilliant university student who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness shortly after I was born. Before she passed away, she had made one last, desperate provision for the daughter she would never know. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about my future. It was about a past I never knew I had. An emergency motion was filed to unseal my original, 30-year-old adoption records. David, a grim-faced court clerk, and an investigator from the district attorney's office, whom David had smartly tipped off about the possibility of financial fraud weeks earlier, descended into the dusty, climate-controlled county archives. They found the file, a thick, brittle manila folder with Miller Anna typed on the tab. And inside they found it. A smaller, sealed envelope, stapled firmly to the inside cover. On the front, in elegant, fading cursive script, were the words, "To be delivered to Anna Dubois upon her 18th birthday." That was my name. My real name. A name I never knew I had. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the envelope David handed me back in his office. I broke the brittle wax seal. Inside was a long, multi-page letter, written on pale blue stationery. It was from my mother, Elise Dubois. It was full of her love, her bottomless heartbreak, and all her hopes for the daughter she would never get to meet. Tucked carefully behind the letter were several official-looking, engraved certificates. "What are these?" I asked, my voice thick with tears as I read my mother's words. David picked one up, his brow furrowed in concentration. His eyes scanned the document, then went wide. "My God," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Anna, these are physical stock certificates. For a little company called Iris Technologies." I had never heard of it. David had. His hand started to shake, mirroring my own. "Anna," he said, his voice trembling with an excitement that bordered on hysteria. Iris Technologies was a tiny, obscure software startup back then. It was nothing. A garage operation. No one knew what it would become. Today it's one of the biggest, most successful tech giants in the world. This is not just a few shares. This is a fortune. And with the stocks was the addendum Judge Hernandez remembered. A legally binding document, signed in triplicate by Richard Miller, Carol Miller, and the young social worker Maria Hernandez. It stated that as my legal guardians, They were required by the court to hold these specific stocks in a protected trust for me, and to turn the entire untouched portfolio over to me on my 18th birthday. They hadn't just broken a public promise. They had committed cold-blooded, calculated, multi-million-dollar fraud. They saw the name of some obscure tech company, gambled that it would amount to nothing, and decided to bury the evidence rather than be bothered with the paperwork. They stole my inheritance. They stole my birthright. They stole my mother's last gift to me. Their greed was so profound, so absolute, that they simply hid the envelope and pretended it never existed, leaving me to struggle for survival while they sat on a secret worth an unimaginable amount of money. Now, I have to be very clear here, this story is my personal experience, and for the sake of telling it, a lot of the complex legal stuff was simplified. The incredible, dramatic way this all went down in court is definitely not how things usually work in the real world. The original case for promissory estoppel was tossed out. A new trial was set, but this time the stakes were infinitely higher. This wasn't a civil suit about a broken promise anymore. This was a criminal case for felony fraud. And the star witness for the prosecution was former Judge Maria Hernandez. She took the stand not as a judge but as a private citizen, and she told the new court everything. She remembered the young, dying mother whose only concern was providing for her child. She described in vivid detail, watching Richard and Carol Miller sign the addendum, their impatience to get the process over with. Her testimony was powerful, credible, and absolutely devastating. The Millers' entire defense fell apart. Faced with a signed document bearing their own signatures and the physical stock certificates, their intricate web of lies turned to dust. They tried to claim they had forgotten about the envelope, that it was a simple, honest oversight in a complicated process. Nobody, not the jury, not the judge, not a single person in that courtroom bought it. Their polished masks of sophistication and charity had finally cracked beyond repair, revealing the ugly, rotting greed that had been festering underneath for 30 years. On the final day of the trial, the new judge, a stern, imposing man named Judge Albright, did not mince words. He looked down from his bench at the Millers, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. "Richard and Carol Miller," he began, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "For 30 years, you have lived a reprehensible lie. You built a national reputation on the foundation of charity while committing a monstrous, calculated fraud against a helpless child entrusted to your care. You didn't just deny her an education. You stole her past and you stole her future. You stole a dying mother's last wish for her only child." He took a deep, steadying breath. "Therefore, this court orders you to pay Anna Dubois the full present-day value of the Iris Technologies stock portfolio, which, with stock splits and dividends, amounts to $94 million. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Carol let out a strangled, weeping cry. Richard looked as if he had been turned to stone. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, for the decades of calculated emotional distress and the malicious, predatory nature of the fraud, this court also awards punitive damages in the amount of $100 million. And finally, Judge Albright declared, his voice rising to a thunderous crescendo, given that this adoption was predicated on a foundation of profound deceit and criminal intent, this court hereby declares the adoption of Anna Dubois by Richard and Carol Miller to be void. It is nullified, as if it never happened. He slammed the gavel down, the sound echoing like a final, definitive gunshot. But it still wasn't over. As the sound faded, two plainclothes detectives, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, stood up. They walked calmly and deliberately to the defendant's table. "Richard Miller, Carol Miller," one said, his voice firm and clear. "You are under arrest for felony fraud, grand theft, and multiple counts of perjury." They were handcuffed right there, in front of everyone, the clicking of the metal cuffs echoing in the silence. Their perfect lives, their empire of lies, collapsed into ruin and ash in a matter of seconds. Their assets were frozen. They weren't the city's sainted philanthropists anymore. They were just common criminals, their faces pale and slack with shock as they were led away. I walked out of that courtroom not as Anna Miller, the unwanted prop, the ungrateful child, but as Anna Dubois. A woman who had been dragged through darkness and despair but had fought her way back to reclaim her name, her story, and her mother's legacy. With the resources I now had, I started a foundation in my birth mother's name, Elise Wish, dedicated to fighting for children lost in the system, to be the voice for others who, like me, had been silenced and erased. I finally had a past I could connect to and a future I could build entirely on my own terms. The condescending smirks of Richard and Carol Miller were gone forever, replaced by the quiet, peaceful smile of a woman who had finally, against all odds, found her justice. My journey was incredibly painful, paved with more betrayal and heartbreak than any person should have to endure. But it taught me a powerful lesson. The truth, no matter how deep you bury it, no matter how much dirt you pile on top of it, always finds a way to the surface. Justice can often feel like an impossible dream, a distant fairy tale, but it is always worth fighting for. In the end, the very people who tried to erase me, who tried to make me nothing, are the ones who inadvertently gave me the strength to find out who I was truly meant to be. Thank you so much for listening to my entire story. If it moved you, please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next, leave a like and a comment below, and perhaps most importantly, share this video with someone you think might need to hear it. Your support means everything.